Few conflicts in modern history have shaped the political, cultural, and social landscape of an entire region like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Stretching back more than a century, this deeply rooted struggle over land, identity, and sovereignty has triggered wars, diplomatic crises, and humanitarian tragedies. But this conflict is not just a matter between Israel and the Palestinians. It is drawn in regional powers such as Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, as well as international heavyweights like Britain, the United States, and the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. In this video, we will delve into the complex history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, explore its far-reaching impact on the Levant and the broader Middle East, and examine the current state of affairs, including the role of external players who have shaped the course of the conflict. To truly grasp the origins of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we must go back to the late 19th century. During this period, Palestine was part of the Ottoman Empire, a vast, multi-ethnic domain stretching across much of the Middle East and North Africa. The local population was overwhelmingly Arab, both Muslim and Christian, though small Jewish communities had long existed in cities like Jerusalem, Hebron, and Safed. At the same time, the rise of Jewish nationalism, known as Zionism, was gaining momentum in Europe. The Zionist movement, founded by Theodor Herzl in 1897, aimed to establish a Jewish homeland in Palestine. Herzl and his followers argued that Jewish people, long subject to persecution and pogroms in Europe, needed a sovereign state to secure their future. Zionism was initially a small, secular movement, but it gained followers, particularly in Eastern Europe and Russia, where anti-Semitism was rampant. The turning point came with World War I and the subsequent collapse of the Ottoman Empire. The British Empire, which had taken control of Palestine after defeating the Ottomans, issued the Balfour Declaration in 1917. This document expressed British support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. But the British had also made conflicting promises to Arab leaders, who believed they would gain independence in exchange for supporting the British against the Ottomans. After World War I, the League of Nations granted Britain a mandate over Palestine, further complicating matters. During this period, Jewish immigration to Palestine increased, driven by rising anti-Semitism in Europe and later the horrors of the Holocaust. By the 1930s and 1940s, tensions between Jewish immigrants and the indigenous Palestinian Arab population had reached a boiling point. Both communities were deeply dissatisfied with British-ruled Jews felt the British were limiting their immigration, while Arabs opposed the growing Zionist presence on what they considered their ancestral land. In 1936, Palestinian Arabs launched a revolt against British rule and Zionist expansion, a rebellion that was brutally suppressed by the British military. By this point, the British were caught between two increasingly hostile factions. In 1947, exhausted by years of conflict and political pressure, Britain handed the issue over to the newly formed United Nations, which proposed a partition plan. The plan called for the creation of two states, one Jewish and one Arab, with Jerusalem as an international city. While the Jewish leadership accepted the plan, the Arab states and Palestinian leadership rejected it, viewing it as an unjust division of their land. This led to the outbreak of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, following the declaration of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948. Several Arab states, Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, invaded in support of the Palestinians. The war resulted in a decisive victory for Israel, which not only secured the land allocated by the UN but also seized additional territory. For the Palestinians, this event, known as the Nakba or catastrophe, resulted in the displacement of hundreds of thousands of people, many of whom fled to neighboring countries like Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan, creating a refugee crisis that persists to this day. The Arab-Israeli conflict continued to escalate through the 1950s, 1960s, and 1970s, with major wars reshaping the region. Egypt, under President Gamal Abdel Nasser, positioned itself as the leader of the Arab world and a staunch opponent of Israel. The 1956 Suez Crisis saw Israel, Britain, and France launch a military intervention after Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, though international pressure, particularly from the United States and the Soviet Union, forced a withdrawal. The most significant of these wars was the Six-Day War in 1967. In this brief but consequential conflict, Israel preemptively struck Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, seizing the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the Golan Heights, and the Sinai Peninsula. This war not only dramatically altered the map of the Middle East but also entrenched the occupation of Palestinian territories, setting the stage for decades of tension. Egypt and Syria sought to reclaim their lost territory in the 1973 Yom Kippur War, which, while initially successful for the Arab states, ended with an Israeli military victory. But it was the diplomatic efforts following these wars that began to shift regional dynamics. In 1979, Egypt became the first Arab country to sign a peace treaty with Israel, facilitated by US President Jimmy Carter at Camp David. In exchange for peace, Israel returned the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt. This was a landmark agreement, but also a deeply controversial one, leading to Egypt's expulsion from the Arab League and the assassination of President Anwar Sadat by Islamic militants. As the regional dynamics shifted, the United States emerged as the key external player in the Israel-Palestine conflict, positioning itself as Israel's strongest ally while also trying to broker peace. The 1990s saw the most significant attempt at resolving the conflict with the Oslo Accords, negotiated under US leadership. Signed in 1993, these accords established a framework for the potential creation of a Palestinian state alongside Israel and led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority. Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin and Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat famously shook hands on the White House lawn, raising hopes for a lasting peace. However, the peace process was fraught with setbacks. Rabin's assassination in 1995 by an Israeli extremist and continued disputes over settlements, Jerusalem, and the right of return for Palestinian refugees undermined the process. The Second Intifada, a violent Palestinian uprising that began in 2000, marked the collapse of the Oslo process and saw a dramatic increase in violence, suicide bombings, and military crackdowns. Since then, the peace process has remained stagnant, with sporadic attempts at negotiation yielding little progress. One of the most controversial issues is Israel's expansion of settlements in the West Bank, land that Palestinians hope to include in a future state. These settlements, which are considered illegal under international law, have been a major point of contention. Meanwhile, the Gaza Strip, controlled by Hamas since 2007, has been the site of multiple conflicts between Palestinian militants and Israeli forces, resulting in severe humanitarian crises. Beyond the immediate neighbors, global powers like the United States, Britain, and the former Soviet Union have played pivotal roles in shaping the conflict. The US has been Israel's primary military and economic backer since the 1960s, providing billions in aid and advanced weaponry, while also attempting to broker peace deals. American presidents from Bill Clinton to Barack Obama and Donald Trump have tried, with varying degrees of success, to mediate the conflict. Trump's administration, for instance, brokered the Abraham Accords, which normalized relations between Israel and several Arab nations like the UAE and Bahrain. But these agreements have done little to address the Palestinian issue. Other nations, such as Britain and France, played significant roles during the early years of the conflict, with Britain's colonial legacy in Palestine continuing to cast a shadow. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union supported Arab states and Palestinian groups, particularly in the 1960s and 1970s, turning the Middle East into yet another battleground for Cold War politics. In the present day, Egypt and Jordan remain key regional players. Egypt has often mediated ceasefires between Israel and Hamas, while Jordan, which has a large Palestinian population, continues to play a delicate balancing act in its relations with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority. Syria, once a major belligerent, has been consumed by its own civil war since 2011, though the Golan Heights remains a point of contention between Israel and the Assad regime. In 2024, the Israel-Palestine conflict remains a highly polarized and deeply emotional issue. Israel continues to exercise control over the West Bank and East Jerusalem, while Gaza remains blockaded and isolated. The expansion of Israeli settlements in the West Bank has made the prospect of a two-state solution increasingly difficult, if not impossible, in the eyes of many analysts. Palestinian political leadership is divided between Fatah in the West Bank and Hamas in Gaza, further complicating efforts for a unified Palestinian front in negotiations. International diplomacy, though active, seems to be at a stalemate. The United Nations continues to issue resolutions condemning settlement activity, but enforcement has been largely symbolic. The Biden administration has tried to reinvigorate dialogue, but deep-seated distrust on both sides remains an obstacle. Meanwhile, the broader region faces its own crises: Syria's civil war, Lebanon's political instability, and Iran's growing influence in the region all complicate any efforts to resolve the Israel-Palestine issue. Yet, despite these challenges, some grassroots movements and civil society efforts continue to push for peace and coexistence, keeping the hope for a resolution alive. The conflict between Israel and Palestine is one of the most protracted and contentious disputes in modern history, with profound implications not only for the people of Israel and Palestine, but for the entire Middle East and the world. While peace remains elusive, the conflict continues to shape global geopolitics, from regional alliances to international diplomacy. As we move forward, the question remains, can a just and lasting peace be achieved? Or will history continue to repeat itself, with new generations inheriting the bitterness of the past? Thank you for watching. If you found this video insightful, please like, subscribe, and stay tuned for more deep dives into global conflicts and their wider impacts.